Welcome to the Sacred Stew. I'm your host, James, and this is my co-host, Anthony. And tonight we're going to talk about Anthony getting shards of metal in his eye.
Yeah, that's the whole time. This is going to be a short episode. Like times like this where I'm reminded of that old Norse proverb, fucking Loki.
Oh, I guess I should have introduced ourselves as the storekeeper and the Norse god.
Yeah, we just lost half our followers, but I'm running with it. Oh man, I still can't get over that shit. Like that's exactly the stuff me and you be talking about.
Tell me, Norse god.
Outside of this, outside of these talks.
It's very prevalent. These people that are essentially have developed cults of personality, where it's almost like they like the fame more than actually trying to revive the actual faith. For those that don't know, we're specifically talking about a channel that has quite a few followers, and they recently put up a post glorifying Loki, which wasn't surprising to me. Seeing other things that they have posted that have always been pretty questionable to me, and recently they posted that that Loki post where they're essentially saying that he will take retribution on the gods for trying to essentially control nature.
So this is the post. Loki, god of natural order. There's a question mark. Loki is often called the god of chaos, though what we see as chaos is in fact the civilized mind perceiving natural order. In the Eddic tradition, the Aesir represent civilized concepts, while the Jotun, on the other hand, are more naturalistic, taking animal form or representing nature as trees, mountains, and wind. Loki, as the most famous Jotun of Vedic myth, is the god of natural order, in contrast to the artificial civilized order that Odin and Heimdall perpetuate. Loki is someone outside the hierarchy of Asgard, even though he is Odin's blood brother. The two rarely interact as anything other than Odin threatening Loki and bending him to his will. While trying to bend nature to our will can create great tools, ships, and even better draft animals, this constant abuse and seeing of ourselves above and separate from the nature is the eventual downfall. Eventually, our children will pay for it and civilization will fall. Loki, in many ways, personifies this eventual retribution. First off, the god of natural order. The god of natural order. Where's anything with this guy, any sort of order? All he's doing is mess everything up. And then Loki's taking retribution on the gods, like, This is where you use your big brain. So we're gonna switch real quick.
So there's a few things for me that really stand out to these posts because it goes at the very heart of our lore. When you sit here and you get these ideas that are now spreading about Loki and what he is and who he is and his position of things. There's a few different schools of thought when it comes to interpreting mythology. One of those schools of thought is called the nature school. And essentially it deduces the gods to archetypal nature figures like Thor is lightning. That comment in that specific post, it not only symbolizes everything wrong with our society today and gets away from how our ancestors traditionally understood the order of the natural world, but it also essentially denigrates what our gods actually are, where there's some sort of misconception that's been perpetuated by modern culture. And I don't want to completely blame the Marvel movies for doing this because I think that's just a symptom of things. But where there's been this balance taken away from people where they don't know what's true and what's not true anymore, because there's so much information out there and there's so many people that seem like they know what they're talking about, that if somebody like this, for example, posts something where people take this as something that's true when it's not.
I mean, because the way it's worded like somebody super intelligent wrote it, worded like somebody that knew what they were talking about wrote it. But, it's like to say that Loki is the god of natural order. Before the gods made the realms, there wasn't order as we understand it. Like, there wasn't really any order at all. So to say that Loki is the god of natural order when there was nothing there is just blatantly false. And the Seidhr are the gods of order, and Loki is not counted amongst them. Like that's 101.
This specific channel, though, and they have a, I call it the Wikipedia copy pasta, where, they copy content from wherever and just post it constantly in their channel. And they're constantly posting content from all sorts of different mythologies and lore. And to me, that's a huge problem. And it's a huge problem because it represents everything about Loki, where he would take things and twist, like we see in the Lokasana, the trial of Loki, where he takes events and he twists the information to try to give some sort of pervasive argument about his situation or what the gods have or have not done. I see this as being true to that same spirit of Loki. I recently got a book, and I know that you and I have talked about it a few times, the Folktales in the IndoEuropean tradition. It's pretty good composition of various tales, and they've dated them with pretty good accuracy. And one of the things that they're talking about in the introduction that really struck me is they were able to trace every single one of these fairy tales essentially through one line, that it all originated from one source in the Indo-European lines, and that there wasn't actually very much cross-contamination of fairy tales and myths from other cultures, because the entire culture of our people would self-edit the information. They would reject it as something that it was not from them. Whereas as we move into the modern era today, that's sort of shifted and changed, because now people get their information, instead of from their culture, they get their information from TV or news anchors or different sources that are essentially a horizontal transmitters of information. I don't know if any of that made sense.
I mean, basically what you're saying is, before we kept our information amongst ourselves and transmitted it from one person to another, and that allowed us to keep out foreign influences. In this day and age, 99% of the information being given out there is from outsiders, people that are either not of European descent and not of the faith of our gods, are the ones disseminating information and trying to tell us what's right and what's wrong. And then you add a further step to that a lot of them are openly saying that, oh, all of these are the same, that they all relate to one another. They're all different versions of one another. And that attempt at unifying the religious cultures of all the worlds only helps in destroying them, not building them.
That's exactly what I am trying to say, I Yes, and that I guess that there's a certain biasness that happens with a folk, with a people, towards things that are from them versus things that aren't from them. And so traditionally in the past, before mainstream media and the information technology that exists in today's world existed, that editing of that information always came via those around you through the culture that you were immersed in. It didn't come from outside sources. And when it did, there would be a biasness or a self-editing that would happen because they would only accept things that were akin to their tradition.
Yeah. And I mean, back then you were getting the whole tribe mentality. You know, you were getting information from, you know, your Jarl, your Gothi, your Githia, your family, somebody else from the family a couple huts down. You know, now it's like we could be sitting in a room full of 10 people, and generally speaking, we are getting our information from 10 different sources, and not one of them is even sitting in the room. That's like an example of the difference between then and now.
So that book, Folktales in the Indo-European Tradition, the introduction is talking about a study that was conducted, I believe, in 2015 with Silva and Tehrani, who used phylogenetic comparative methods, which is a scientific technique that's been used to trace genetics between different biological organisms. It's also been used in anthropological ways to see how different cultures have evolved over time. And it's also been used in linguistics to map out the relationships between different languages and how they evolved over time. So Silva and Tehrani did a study where they used this algorithm to trace essentially tail type markers in different stories that they found throughout various European traditions and folktales that have survived. And for example, a tail type would be something where a plot or a storyline is similar in different tales. Like, for example, the grinding of the salt and how salt came to be. There's several folk tales that tell us a story about how this came to be in different European traditions. And they're able from that to map out how this transmission happens and how old the stories actually are. So what they found were that more than 50% of the European folktales were most likely originated in the last common ancestor of at least one major Indo-European subfamily. And 31 tale types were more than 70% likely to have originated from a single Indo-European source. So in other words, some of these folktales are more likely than not to go back even as far as Proto-Indo-European culture itself, and some probably even further than that. What the researchers also found was that most of the tales were transmitted vertically, which means from like one generation directly down to the next generation within that culture, rather than horizontally transplanted from another cultural tradition to our tradition. Transmission or cross-contamination from other cultures was essentially edited out by the people of the culture itself, where they would not accept it. So the closer your neighbor was actually, you were less likely to adopt their folklore into your own tradition.
You said that the closer your neighbor was, the less likely you were to absorb their tales into your tradition?
Correct. According to Silva and Tehrani, in their 2015 study of all of these mythologies and folktales, that they found that the closer your neighbor was, the less likely you were to actually absorb their traditions or cultures or stories.
Well, I'm sure they got something to support that. My initial thought is that doesn't quite make sense because, if you're one tribe and you got neighboring tribes around you, some you're going to be going to war with, some you're going to be doing business with or whatever. Like, there's going to be melting, especially among other tribes of the same folk.
Right. And I don't think the study is trying to suggest that there wasn't some melding of histories or interaction with other people, but more so when it came to like folktales or the mythological stories of the gods and such, that you were less likely to adopt foreign gods and foreign tales into your own tradition. So they can map this out, the transmission from different points in history based upon the relationships of the stories that have been recorded and survive to this day by these tale types that are contained within the stories. One of what I found interesting is they found that some of the Poetic Edda is actually dates back before the Common Era in the tale types that it's speaking about.
Are there any specific ones you can remember off the top of your head, and how?
Several folk tales show up in various lays of the Poetic Edda. So this, I'm quoting the book now. Perhaps the most marked example is in Grotesöngr, where an ATU tale type 565, the magic mill, can clearly be seen. In typical folktale of this type, like, for example, Why the Sea is Salt, a poor man is sent to hell where he finds a mill that will magically grind out whatever he wishes, which he exploits to his great advantage. Anyways, then he goes on explaining this tale type. Another example in the Poetic Edda is the lay concerning the knife flung cycle. So to win the hand of Gunnar's sister, Sigurd must help Gunnar woo the strong woman Brynhild. And it goes on explaining that tale type and that story, which was tale type they labeled 519. So the same tale type is seen in other Indo-European traditions as well. And then also tale type 673, which is the white serpent's flesh. And it was a story the story of Michael Scott, who learns from an old wise woman how to slay a mythical white serpent that can regenerate itself. And it goes on describing that tale type in the story. I want to quoting this book here, after it describes a few examples from the Poetic Edda of these various tale types. It says, all of this would be interesting enough for its own sake, but the presence of these ATU tale types in these lays has bearing on the question of how genuine the heathen voice of the Poetic Edda is. The Silva Tehrani study traces all three tale types cited to the Proto-Baltic Slava era of the Indo-European migrations. So we can be confident that these plot elements of the Poetic Edda go back not just to the 9th century, but to the 8th century before the Common Era.
What they're saying is that for the story types and how they were written, or how they are written, they are able to approximate the original date of these stories as read to about you said the 8th century BC?
Yeah, the 8th century BCE. And there were some other tale types too from European and Germanic folklore that they were actually able to trace back to about 6,000 years ago.
So in other words, more proof that the Poetic Edda is a heathen text.
Absolutely.
All right, well,
I know we're kind of... Go ahead.
I was just being a dork. I was going to say, well, another one for us, and I'm still not seeing any shots from the other side.
Well, and I know we're kind of jumping around in this conversation because we talked about us being your keeper and the Nordic god, but But and then we jump to talking about this. For those that haven't followed our episodes, we've kind of had an open conversation about different parts of the mythological timeline of events that we know about from our lore and our the stories that have been handed down to us. We started with creation and how that all began, and moved into the golden age when the gods established order, and also went into a few different theories about different beings who they may or may not be. And we kind of worked ourselves in the last episode talking about Thor and his appearance in the mythological timeline and some events that happened to him. And so we saw in those events how the Golveigheid is spreading misinformation around, trying to change the true nature and state of people, harming them, causing all sorts of misfortune, not just among people, but the gods. Then we learn later in the mythological tale about how the mead was stolen from Mimir, and they've taken it away. And now last week we went over Thor's introduction into the mythological scene of how they tried to test him for his strength to see how strong he is, because he had killed his foster parents, which were giants at the time. And I had speculated that these giants, or Thor was given to them as part of the hostage trade between the different tribes. And then they tried to kill him. And then they stole his hammer, and then Thor had to go retrieve his hammer. And we kind of hinted at there being different ritualistic aspects being explained to us about Thor's hammer and the protection that it offers for different sacred rites, like the raising of the dead, the marriage ceremony, and then the protection that it gives from evil forces that would seek to harm someone. And the next event that ties into the chronological story is about the building of the wall around Asgard. And all of this, to me, and what we kind of were going on a tangent a bit at the beginning of this episode, to me, it all kind of falls in line together, because the gods saw the danger that was coming, that the Jotun were now increasing in power again and increasing in their ability and numbers. And they have now tried and tested the gods and have even attempted to take very sacred things away from them that they needed. And I think that's what we have to do in today's age, where we have to realize the importance of safeguarding ourselves from all of this information that essentially tries to distort our understanding of our faith and our history as a people. Because if we don't do that and we just leave ourselves open, we hear constant enough where people are always speaking about how, well, they don't know what to believe because one person says something, another person says something else. And a lot of that confusion has happened because the way our society is today, where we have a horizontal transmission of information, where there's a source that's foreign from our own people, giving us the information, and essentially telling us how we need to live our lives.
Do you think the myth of the wall getting built, we can see a lot of parallels into, today, all the wars going on, all the other political stuff that would make some people feel that they are under attack or pressure and they need to guard themselves and their families from malicious intentions. And I think another big thing we're lacking too on that same note is more people like us putting out the right information. I I'm not usually one to say that, but more and more, like, the stuff I'm reading and the way I'm looking at things, you know, a line has to be drawn in the sand. And, you know, like that stuff about, you know, Loki being the
But how
natural
do
god of
but
order.
but
That's a lie. That is wrong.
how do people recognize this?
So to
For
a
the
certain,
average person when they're out there, yeah, the average person when they're out there, you know, they see all these different pieces of information from so many different sources. How are they going to know which information is correct and which information is false?
so that's kind of a gray area because, you know, there's always that response of, oh, read some books. Well, books is where they're getting a lot of this bad information anyway. But I mean, there are a lot of good books out there with good information. But I think to a certain degree, it's get yourself around other people that share your religious and worldview, you know, and look for people and groups that have been around for a while and have been educating themselves, because we're not going to be able to differentiate all of it as a bunch of individuals. You know, like, I'm sorry for the people that want to just figure it all out on their own. You won't. I'm sorry. There's too much. Like, you got to find people that you can trust. You got to be around people that know what they're talking about, that have learned what they're talking about from other people that know what they're talking about. Like, especially the people that are out there brand new. Like, this is one of the important things of being a part of a kindred, a tribe, whatever you want to call it, having a community.
There's a couple things that people can do where they can begin to decipher and weed out things that aren't true or not true. The number one premise that I would encourage everybody to start out at is that our gods are absolutely real, that they are not just the lightning, they're not just a tree, they're not a rock, they're not anything other than whatever sort of being that they are. I can't describe that. It's beyond my words. They can take different forms and shapes and have different interactions in different ways. But the moment that you begin to denigrate essentially the god status from what they are, gods, to mere physical representations or psychological archetypes of different things, you begin to go down a slippery path of denigrating what it actually means for our gods to be gods. The second thing that I would tell people to do whenever they're reading different things is always question, what source does this come from? This person says that this is the way that we practice our faith, but where did this information come from? For example, let's talk a little bit about, because this is always a hot topic. Let's talk a little bit about seidhr, right? Today, in today's age, there's this huge misconception where people think that seidhr is just some type of energy magic. But that is not how our ancestors understood it. Our ancestors understood seidhr to be something very different than just energy magic. Seidhr, as described in the Voluspa, we're told that those who practice seidhr follow after the evil witch Golveig High, whom the gods have killed 3 times. So we have a reference right there from the lore about the perception of seidhr. Now, I know that many people like to argue about, well, Freya's the one that brought this to the gods. She taught it. Odin practiced it. And so it can't be that bad. But the part of the story that everybody is missing is the practicing of seidhr is what actually caused the chaos and brings about the destruction of the gods. Odin did practice seidhr and used it in the incident that's called the Rape of Rind. But he was later sentenced and expelled from Asgard over these actions as part of a peace treaty in the war between the gods that ends up happening here in the future. In a peace treaty, he is exiled from Asgard for 10 years. And it's when he came back, that is when he forbade the practice of seidhr. Now, that's not the practice of magic in general. It was the practice of seidhr specifically that Odin forbid. Too many people think that seidhr is just magic in general, but that's not what seidhr is. Seidhr is the practice of manipulating people's minds to get them to do things which are unnatural to them to do, their natural fate. For example, when Freyr fell madly in love with Gerd, Freyr was put under a love spell by Gerd's mother, who is Golveig Hyde. And this love spell caused Freyr to become so ill and so sick that he could not think of and do anything other than wanting to be with Gerd. And as a result of this, Golveig Hyde was able to affect Freyr in such a way that he was willing to give up the sword, which becomes the doom of the gods at Ragnarok.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing about seidhr being a form of magic, not the word for magic. It took me 5 minutes and Google. I looked up an online English to Old Norse translator. I typed in the word magic, and I came up with at least 6 to 7 different words for magic. So to those that try to say that magic is seidhr, no, it is a form of magic, and this differential needs to get understood. Again, this is another thing where there are people that are wanting to blend everything and get things confused, and this is one of the things they're pushing. Because when you're doing seidhr, you're breaking, you're doing something that Odin forbade everyone from doing. Odin may have done it, but he has not done it since. Freya has been talked about doing it before all the bad stuff happened, and none of the gods, since all the stuff was settled out, have done seidhr. They have done magic, but they have not done seidhr. Spend 5 minutes and up your vocabulary just a little bit.
I also would point out to the history of it as well, because our folk understood before Christianity that there was ill magic and that there was healing magic. And the healing magic, which were given to us by the gods, was called Gulderlach. And this was the form of magic which the gods had given to us in order to heal and create good things and to protect ourselves. Now, seidhr itself was always understood to be, and I'm going to use a Christian term, although the concept itself is not Christian. It existed before Christianity, black magic. So seidhr was always understood to be an ill form of magic because the person that brought it was Golveig Hyde, and she became a handmaiden of Freya and essentially taught Freya this, and Freya began showing the other gods the use of this new form of magic, and the gods began using it, and chaos erupted, and people began breaking the laws of natural order. This concept was carried over after the Christian conversion. The Christians had a heck of a time of trying to get rid of a lot of our folk practices and beliefs. And so what they would do is they would just rebrand certain things. They would recategorize what something is. For example, Snorri Sturluson, we learn about in his list of gods and goddesses, he puts a goddess by the name of Hela. That is not actually a correct concept of our folk. Hela was an interpolation of the Christians, where they tried to convince the folk that going to hell was a bad place. Loki's daughter is Lakin. She is a demon or a being of affliction that brings misfortune. And so what the Christians had did was they made her as the overseer of hell, because everybody knew who Lakin was. And they then began associating hell with a negative place to go. The same thing happened with our different traditions and folktales and such, where they would overlay the original myths with certain editing that would happen. For example, in folktales, you'll often hear them talk about like the devil appeared, or the devils appeared. What they're actually talking about is the old Germanic gods and wights and Vatir and such. That's what they're actually talking about. But the Christians would overlay it with the editing of calling it a devil. And the same thing happened with magic, where they began labeling any of the folk magic as black magic, or magic that was given from Golveig High. And then we see later on in the development of our folk, as we're now fleeing Europe, and Christianity is becoming very embedded throughout Europe and following even the Icelanders from Europe to Iceland, where we see in the sagas where now they start about seidhr in such a way that it's not disassociated with other forms of magic that our folk had in practice. So that's where this misconception began with. And then our buddy, Stephen Flowers, when he published his 9 Doors of Midgard in that work, and he's incorporating all of these archetypal and magical formulas from the Temple of Set, or that satanic organization, he begins incorporating this and weaving this information in with knowledge about our gods and the worlds and such, in a way that it became so popular that people have grasped onto these concepts, and they think that this is actually the true form, and that seidhr is nothing more than just magic and such. But that is not how our ancestors understood seidhr to be. Seidhr was always viewed as something that causes ill, and that Odin had forbidden it after he returned from his exile from Asgard. The tale about the wall being built around Asgard, I think it fits really well with our conversation, because we have to do the same thing. We have to build a wall around ourselves where we shield ourselves from the outside influences. We have to begin self-editing the narrative, because if we don't, then everybody that's trying to learn about our religion, and I'm not going to say, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people will be misled. You have these cults of personality on YouTube, for example, like Harith Hargerstein, where he teaches people that there is such a thing as Thursatru and the Rakatru, and all of these just absurd magical and religious and spiritual practices that did not actually exist among our folk. So since we're talking about Asgard and the wall being built, this is the next thing that happens in the chronological timeline after the meat is stolen from Mimir. The Jotuns test Thor, and Thor is also, they try to assassinate him. Then they steal his hammer, and then the gods decide to build the wall around Asgard to protect Asgard. You want to give us that story as it's relayed to us in the lore?
All right. Anthony's real quick sum up. So after realizing the threats that are out there, the gods decide that they need to build a wall around Asgard. And right about this time, a mysterious stranger comes along and says that he can build a wall tall enough and strong enough around all of Asgard that no Jotun would be able to breach. And they're like, oh, that's great. When could you get it done? And he's like, I can get it done. They're in the beginning of winter. And he said, I can get it done by the first day of spring. And they're like, okay, well, what do you want? And he's like, well, I want Freya for my wife, and I want Suna, and I want Manny, the sun and the moon, for those that don't know. So the gods convene amongst themselves, and they're like, no, no, that's too much. We got to find another way. And Loki is like, no, there's no way he could possibly do it. There's no way he could possibly build a wall tall enough and strong enough to keep out the Jotuns by the first day of spring. So Loki's saying, we're going to use this to our advantage. We'll have him build most of it. So we'll tell him, okay, by the first day of spring. But if the last stone is not laid before the first day of spring, he gets nothing for his work. So, okay, that's what we'll do. So they go tell him, and he immediately starts getting to work. And him and his horse, and they're building this up, and they're sitting there, they're fretting about it, and it's down to the wire. They've got like 3-4 days left before the first day of spring, and he's got the whole thing almost built. So the gods convene. They snatch Loki up by the hem of the neck, and they're like, look, we're in this situation because we trusted what you said, and you were false, so now you're going to figure it out. And, or we're going to kill you. And so at night, Loki as a man in his shape-shifting abilities goes out as a mare, which is a female horse, even though he's a guy, and seduces the giant's horse. And because of that, the giant isn't able to finish the wall. He doesn't get paid. Come to find out, he's a giant anyway. And I think Thor kills him or beats him up and sends him packing. And a little bit after that, Loki comes back leading the 8-legged horse that he had given birth to and offered Sleipnir as a gift to Odin in compensation for the mishap.
From how I understand it, Thor did kill the giants after he was called by the gods because he was still away. But then the gods actually called him back, and then he slayed the giant. And I think there was a little bit of a time when Loki was missing before he returned with Sleipnir. But yeah, no, he did give that as a gift to Odin as recompense for the situation. Again, we see another situation here with Loki where he is somehow involved in a plot to that involves taking gods or goddesses away, taking the sun and the moon away, and the gods weren't going to have that.
So another thing is we can't have giants building our walls. We can figure it out ourselves.
How do we build our walls? Because, I mean, this is an important conversation that I know that our communities had as far as like protecting our circle, our sacred circle, our space. And how do we defend that in today's day and age?
Well, I think a good first step as far as like just guarding the information is, like we've said repeatedly, and some of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing, we need to do more of people like us putting information out there to create the process where we can again start the vertical transmission of knowledge among folk and then a strong community in their area. And if you don't have it, you need to build it. I'm someone that's trying to build in my town right now. It's a process. But once you've got these great, kindreds or whatever you want to, call your group, then you have to take it to the next level of building relations with other like-minded kindreds that are out there, not just the next town over, not just in your general portion of the country, we've got to start branching out and creating a network so we're all intertwined. That's how our wall needs to get built, is like a network. I'm not saying everybody's got to go join a national org, but build your community, and then everyone from your community is probably going to know at least one person somewhere else that is also a heathen. Start building those connections with those other kindreds, groups, whatever.
One thing that you said is huge. Reacquiring the vertical transmission of our faith to one another. And I think that Thor brings a lot of what we need to the table with that. If we think about the stories of Thor and Thor's hammer and the events that he had to go through and the different ordeals that different gods had to go through, we see a lot of examples of what people would call rites of passage, where people go through different phases of their life to learn different skills, to learn different knowledge. And today, I think that there's so much information out there that people take it for granted, where it's, for example, oh, I need to know something, I can just Google it real quick and go to Wikipedia, or I can go to the Lore Keeper's channel and just see what he copy pasted from Wikipedia. And then I know everything. Where there's no actual connection to that story and no personal meaning or relation to what is essentially the practice of our faith. So building rites of passage in Thor's hammer, we know that, for example, Thor raises the dead, he protects the crops, he protects the wife's womb, he protects the honor in the marriage, and he does a lot of things. And I see him as a very core figure that's presiding over these rites of passage and blessing them at their different stages of development. For example, we had mentioned in an episode, a couple episodes ago, about the tradition of bear hunting. We know clearly that Thor is associated with the bear. And one of the biggest rites that any person could ever do would be to go on a bear hunt. And it was very ritualistic. Everything that was done a very specific way. But after these rites of passage, that's when the person would be elevated in status. And that tradition, whether it's oral or an actual rite that is done or an act that is done, is what connects us to the tradition. It connects us to that memory of our folk. It connects us to the stories and the tales and the legends and the myths that have been handed down to us. And until we start respecting that knowledge and that information in a way that is personally absorbed by us, by the way we live our lives, we'll never truly be able to build a good wall of protection around ourselves, because people haven't had to go through ordeals or connect in a spiritual way.
Well, I think especially these days, what any type of ordeal would do was get people to put some skin in the game. Get people to not just be somebody, sitting on the outskirts, just watching and saying, something here and there, like just being involved at all. to the best of your abilities, you know? And I think, because when I've read about, you know, these rites of passages, you know, if it wasn't the whole tribe, it was, you know, like all the men or all the women, you know, like it was the rites of passage weren't just about building up the person, it was also about building the community. And like everything had more than one function, and everybody continued to do things to have some skin in the game, to have a reason to care. We must learn to love ourselves. If we do not love ourselves, if we do not love our people, how can we say we love our ancestors or our gods? This has been The Sacred Stew. My name is Anthony. My co-host is James. Y'all have a good night.